You know, suffering is a weird subject to talk about. On one hand, and understandably so, people often are trying to get rid of as much of it as possible, not only in their lives, but the lives of others too. And while misfortune, bad luck, and adversity represent great catalysts for the things we all dream of in life, if you've ever actually been through something hard, well, it sucks in the moment. But it's those times after years of hard work, of sleepless nights and depressing failures, of striving for something no one else thought you were capable of, that we finally see the fruits of our pain breed a soul into something so much greater. And one of the main drivers behind my undying love for games as a medium is their unique ability to capture this fleeting feeling for but a moment and pump it into our hearts and minds over and over again. Whether that be in massive multiplayer online worlds or challenging single-player bouts, games at their core tap into the primal instinct of what makes us human, and even more interestingly, what makes life so great too. As Plato said thousands of years ago, for a man to conquer himself is the first and noblest of all victories. And that's because it's only by gaining control over ourselves, over the power within us, that we finally get to live the lives we covet with such regard. But in order to do that, we must first face our biggest fears head on and invite suffering into our lives, all in the service of leveling up our character and saving the world. So today I'm going to show you exactly why I think pain is so vital in the games we play and love, and the deeper meaning it has behind our real lives too. You know, I'm always looking at feedback from you guys in the comments section on what I can do better and how to improve my videos. And one of the biggest suggestions I see time and time again is to try out new games and analyze things that just aren't predominantly my wife and side chick, Cyberpunk 2077 and Prey. And these proposals have led me down the path of trying out a bunch of new things like JRPGs, which I still have trouble loving, and smaller indie titles that I never gave a shot because I wasn't sure they were for me. But amongst a sea of so many titles that honestly fell flat, the ones that did stick with me all had one thing in common. They were hard. And I think that's for a very specific reason, because it's only the games where I not only enjoyed the design, world, and gameplay, but also the feelings they gave me that I remember. And I think most of those feelings actually came from the sense of accomplishment I felt beating them, or pride I felt in figuring out something the experience had to offer. And emotions like that only have a lasting impact when you actually have to work hard in order to achieve them. After all, having a six-pack and being a multi-millionaire wouldn't be very impressive if everyone had already accomplished both. It's why they're so revered in our society today, and that same principle carries over to games too. For example, two smaller titles that really stuck out to me recently were Pacific Drive and Frostpunk. Because for as fun and interesting as both of these games are, they also are both ruthlessly hard. In Frostpunk, you are literally barely surviving day after day in extreme freezing temperatures as you keep your dying band of people alive, requiring you to make sacrifices daily of personnel as well as valuable resources, all in an attempt to remain standing by the end of winter. And the gameplay is just as grueling as the setup sounds. Children and families are constantly becoming sick and injured, people are dying in the streets, and in order to beat the game, you have to either force long hours of work for your citizens or maintain perfection in resource gathering and tactics, all with a myriad of choices that seem to have no right answer. In fact, if you fail in any way during these trials, you will have to start over at the very beginning of the game once again with an entire winter ahead of you, or return to a save that might already be doomed because of your past choices. In Pacific Drive, by contrast, instead of controlling an entire city, you simply are the driver behind one mysterious paranormal car that has been caught up in a top-secret government zone with no way out but driving right into the heart of the madness. You have to set up one adventure after another deeper into this foreboding zone, as throughout each drive you are met by an entire host of new anomalies and strange entities that will attack your car, launch you off ledges, or rip the doors from your vehicle right off their hinges. And with every little bit of damage you take, every scrape on your car, or bump into a tree you make, you suffer damage that then must be repaired and salvaged in order to go out again. And worst of all, at the end of each run, you must full speed make your way back to a closing circle that if you fail to drive into in time, you lose almost everything. Your car will be wrecked and your supplies gone, meaning potentially hours of fighting for your life and gathering to progress. You simply lose it all. No save games to back you up, no checkpoints, you just teleport back to your garage much further behind than you were before. Because both Pacific Drive and Frostpunk have a ruthless view on struggle and suffering in games. In both titles, failure is not an option, and when you do face defeat, you are met with the worst kind of loss, where all of your work from before can be written off as a complete waste of time in many cases. Or you will be set back so far you will be banging your head against a wall in anger. And yet, despite how agonizing that sounds, and by the way, it is, trust me, that sense of suffering and intensity and difficulty is also, funnily enough, what makes both games so great too. Because in contrast to the harrowing defeats, the successes and victories in games too feel so satisfying. When I first made my way into the Deep Zone, the second part of the Pacific Drive journey, which was home to even crazier monsters and mysteries to solve, I felt an immense sense of elation, not only because the zone was cool, other games have cool lore and mystery too, but because I knew how much I struggled to get there, and I finally did it. All of those tires that went flat, all of my broken windshields I had to repair, or headlights that lost power as I had to sift my way through a completely dark forest full of trees I crashed into in a desperate escape only to die, suddenly became all worth it. Because I had pulled off something that was actually worth pulling off. A game that wasn't just fun, but also gave me a sense of pride too. Something unique to games as an arts medium. And it's really underrated just how much more that can make you fall in love with any title. I thought the lore and world was interesting in Pacific Drive before, but after such huge successes, after countless hours of suffering, I almost felt like I owed it to myself to keep playing to figure out more. And it really does make you feel so much more invested in a game and everything it has to offer. Or in Frostpunk, beating the game for the first time and realizing I was only able to do so because I had mastered the mechanics so well that I truly deserved it after so many deaths. That's the kind of feeling that only a game that relishes in the difficulty can provide. And it's something we crave as human beings too. For as much as we complain about struggle and sacrifice, if you think back on the most nostalgic parts of your life or the moments that define who you are now, usually they were from the hard times, not the easy ones. In a way, nostalgia is nothing more than memories without the pain, and there's a reason for that. Pain, as weird as it sounds, breeds fulfillment and thus happiness. And the games we play often are addictive not only because they are mindless pleasure, but rather something a little deeper than that. I mean, really think about it for a second. Difficulty is intrinsically at the core of what makes us want to play games in the first place. For instance, why do you think so many gamers like achievements? On the surface, they are essentially completely useless, nothing more than a fake set of points or rewards that don't actually mean anything. But it's because achievements show to ourselves and others, if only for a moment, that we did something hard and won. And it's also why the most sought after achievements out there are, you guessed it, always the most grueling ones. The PlayStation Platinums, Steam achievements no one bothered to subject themselves to, or the satisfying Xbox ding sound that only a small percentage of each achiever hears. Or what about speedrunners? People who intentionally play a game in a way it wasn't meant to be played just to try and get a new record that others will admire. Why do these gamers spend so much time of their lives learning the exact timing for jumps, or put so much effort into seeing how fast they can open doors and slide down hills? It's because the human spirit at its deepest level craves suffering. Because only in suffering do our souls find purpose, meaning, and admiration from others due to our accomplishments and tenacity. Imagine playing something like Elden Ring, Dark Souls, or Bloodborne on easy mode, where every boss was mindlessly defeated, the world felt inviting and happy rather than dangerous, and learning the lore was as simple as engaging with the main story rather than having to piece together everything yourself through countless droves of incoherent writing. The pain of going through all of that is the exact reason so many people love FromSoft games games in the first place, and also the reason so many other studios are clamoring to make similar entries like Lies of P that evoke the same emotion. In an industry that was making easier and easier games every year, FromSoft went against the grain and started to make extremely difficult titles, which resonated with audiences everywhere so much because they felt like an actual challenge, an actual journey, not just witless button pressing. And just like how in Pacific Drive I grew to love the game more and more because of the intense difficulty, often the bosses I remember most and are talked about most online in something like Elden Ring are the ones that provided the biggest obstacle. Entire memes were made about beating Millennia, the hardest boss in the game for example, or even easy bosses like the Ancestral Spirit leave such a lasting impact because of how hard they were to find initially. In the Ancestral Spirit's case, you only get to this hulking beast if you stumble upon a secret underground cave full of stars, after which you then deduce you need to light a series of torches that will then unlock a random deer carcass at the top of a temple. None of this shows up in quest logs, none of it are things that the game tries to hold your hand for, and uncovering the Ancestral Spirit or beating a boss like Millennia comes down to nothing more than your skill and determination as a player. Or in other words, things that aren't given to you easily. In fact, my biggest gripe with a lot of other open world games after playing Elden Ring is exactly this problem. In Ubisoft open worlds, for example, like Assassin's Creed and Far Cry, everything is so easy and straightforward, and because of that, nothing feels worthwhile. When every single quest, all hidden treasure, and anything interesting is displayed on my map with a question mark or map marker for me to see, all of the adventure and struggle of figuring that out for myself goes right out the window. Knowing what's behind every corner makes it so that none of those corners in the map matter anymore. And when you combine that with combat that lacks the depth and challenge of Elden Ring as well, eventually after playing Ubisoft games for long enough, for example, you start to ask yourself the question, why? And the funniest thing is, Ubisoft games are actually fun to play. The moment-to-moment action is pretty good. There are cool takedown animations and ways to infiltrate bases and take on multiple enemies, and they're really beautiful. But none of that actually matters when there isn't a deeper challenge at all in the gameplay, design, or narrative. The answers are always spoon-fed to us, and because of that, our brains have nothing left to look forward to. The challenge in a game, just like in real life as well, is innate to the motive behind why we play in the first place. Even Helen Keller, a woman that was unable to see or hear, learned through her adversity what this exact meaning of life was. Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, vision cleared, ambition inspired, and success achieved. And for me, it's also a perfect example of what makes games so interesting when compared to, say, movies, television, or music. They add that extra element of suffering that is crucial to what makes our real lives so memorable in the first place and allow us to either fail or overcome challenges, giving us a sense of pride or frustration that no other mediums can. And for those of you that are curious, this same principle is the reason immersive sims are my favorite genre of games out there. And for those of you who aren't curious, you're in too deep now. Because the reason things like Deus Ex, Prey, Underrail, and to a lesser extent even BioShock speak to me so much is that they're all games that focus on giving the player agency over the environment, with lots of different ways to tackle problems, while as often as possible answering yes to any time the player asks whether they can do something. And when you design a game around core principles like this, it allows you so much more freedom in making difficult and also interesting confrontations. Like in Prey, how you can use the glue cannon to not only freeze enemies in place, but also to build makeshift staircases to high up places that you otherwise wouldn't see until the end of the game. Or even one case where I literally beat the game 20 hours before I was supposed to by spending an hour stacking boxes and making glue bridges to get to a working escape pod without using a special key first to deploy a bridge. When you give players such an extensive sense of freedom like this, it allows them to solve things in their own way, and because there are so many different options, you can craft encounters that are much more difficult and require the player to think on the fly. And I can't tell you how satisfying it was beating Prey like that for the first time so early on, because it really made me feel powerful even when going up against a game that could throw a lot of BS at me at times. Because the thing is, while suffering and hardship in games can be extremely rewarding, it's only when that difficulty is also designed well that it all comes together. Because when there are issues, it can unravel quickly. A perfect example of this, in my opinion, is something I think a lot of you might actually disagree with me on, and that's Hollow Knight. For as great as the combat, exploration, and world is in this pseudo 2D adventure that has an adoring fanbase, one of the most frustrating things about playing it, for me at least, is how difficulty is handled a lot of the time. And what I mean by that is instances like trying to see the palace grounds or White Palace, where you have to find the monarch wings first to even get there, which for those of you that don't know, allow you to double jump at any time to reach higher spots. The difficulty in sections like this comes from the fact that I have to scour and traverse any portion of an already explored map I missed, all in search of this one item I need to progress. And this can be seen all over the game too, with other issues like locked doors that require a specific key, zones that can only be reached through oddly specific secret entrances, or items that simply lie in wait in some obscure part of a zone that are a requirement for me to move on. Challenge or suffering like this is so frustrating because it almost feels like the game has no respect for our time or intelligence. Like walking up to a locked door and realizing exactly what I need to do, but knowing I will have to monotonously search through random previously explored places again, now this time with lower intrigue, just to find what I need. Does it make the game harder? Definitely. But I would argue not in a way that actually makes it more interesting too. In contrast, a game like Deus Ex or Prey would simply show you a door that you have absolutely no idea how to open, but give you 10 different ways to do it, all of which would feel infinitely more satisfying than backtracking for 30 minutes through a previous map in Hollow Knight to find one annoying key whose purpose is already perfectly clear. Both of these scenarios provide a good amount of challenge, but only one of them challenges more than just your patience. And here's the other thing too. For as much as I personally love labor and difficulty in games, for as much meaning as it gives the whole experience, there's another side too. Because most people aren't playing games for meaning, or often even for a real challenge. Most people, whether you like it or not, just want to play a fun video game. It's really as simple as that. After a hard day at work grinding away and dealing with the constant stresses of life, the majority of gamers want to simply turn off their brain, load up their PC or console, and have a constant stream of dopamine injected into their veins. But here's the thing, I don't actually think that's exactly right. Because even for the most casual among us, even for the people who see games as nothing more than a mindless distraction, that distraction still relies heavily on challenge. Call of Duty Warzone wouldn't be fun without somewhat competent enemies on the other side. Candy Crush wouldn't be nearly as popular if it didn't constantly result in failure, and the most ubiquitous thing about Minecraft is a giant green man who runs at you and explodes, destroying everything you've spent so much time building. The real key to suffering in games is making sure to find the right balance. For example, one of the biggest controversies about StarCraft 2 when it came out was how much easier than the first game it was. Despite still being brutally difficult, tweaks to certain mechanics and how the game played overall made it a lot easier to navigate. And one of the most pressing controversies was the fact that you could select many more units at once. In the first StarCraft, the one I grew up as a kid playing with my dad, you could only select 12 units at a time, which meant in order to control your entire army and workers at your base, you had to constantly be dragging and moving your mouse around like a conductor in a symphony, even for the most basic of maneuvers. Creating hotkeys for even small bands of units was crucial for victory, and this mechanic alone sent the skill ceiling of the game into the stratosphere. But in StarCraft 2, that unit control count went to 200 at once, an over 10 times increase, meaning you could quite literally select your entire army at once and just send it into the enemy base without thinking. Before, what would have taken a small feat of genius and years of practice was as easy as a simple drag of the mouse across the screen. But you see, maybe that isn't such a bad thing after all. Because in a lot of ways, this change actually made the series better. By lowering the bar to entry just enough, StarCraft 2 was able to reach extraordinary levels of success, and even though it wasn't as hard as the first game, it still managed to maintain a very high skill ceiling that most competitive games nowadays aren't even close to approaching. Sometimes suffering and struggle in games isn't about just making something as grueling and depressing as possible, but rather the exact right blend of pain mixed with elevating power. Or what about a game series like Halo? I'm sure for lots of us, our most fond memories as kids playing games were those late nights in co-op Halo lobbies, trying to beat the game on the hardest difficulties, or even soloing it ourselves to get that badge of honor. But while the most sought after achievement was beating the game on the legendary difficulty mode, the hardest in the game, if anything, this mode just wasn't even that fun. Enemies are bullet sponges, a grunt tickling you might result in death, and stray bullets or random things hitting you will make you rage at the unfairness of it all. In contrast though, Heroic, the difficulty just below Legendary, is often so much better. Enemies and encounters are still a challenge while not being overbearing, guns actually feel punchy and effective rather than like Nerf bullets, and you still get that satisfaction of victory because it's by no means a walk in the park in its own right. And this all culminates in an experience that arguably is better despite it being easier. Because you see, while struggle and hardship in games is so important, it's also crucial to make sure it doesn't become so overbearing to the point where it's just monotonous and pointless. Because there's always some players that will want to beat any game at the highest levels of pain imaginable. But for the general public and out of concern for good game design, usually a more toned down balance is needed. Even in games that are often seen as difficult like Dark Souls, there are certain weapons or builds that will give you a much easier time than others. And one of the key reasons people like to grind away at games but not hard things in real life is because games often have a way to make things easier, while in real life we often don't. So I totally understand why players are so quick to dismiss the idea of difficult games, or put so little focus and emphasis into it. But deep down, I think even in cases like this, most players actually want more challenge than they even originally think. Take even a super laid-back game like Stardew Valley, where it's about as mellow as you could imagine. You simply buy seeds at the local market, plant them, and grow a garden to your heart's content. But even in such an inconspicuous romp like this one, the most memorable moments usually come from the hardship too. Your crops dying out due to weather, a crazy wizard next door you must confront head-on, or a big commotion in the town square that you have to go and check out. If Stardew truly was nothing but growing a garden with no setbacks, it would get boring so quickly. The fact that plants can die by not being watered, certain vegetables need specific conditions, and animals can come and steal from you make the entire experience so much more engaging. And funnily enough, if you really think about it, everything that makes Stardew so addicting and fun to play are the exact things that would be so annoying in our real lives. Being a farmer and having to deal with animals and the weather is an arduous experience. Trust me, I know as a kid who had a grandpa who worked on a farm. But it's that same challenge that makes playing a game fun over and over. And I think that's because even in our real lives, adversity is the bedrock for the same sense of interest and pride we get in games. Without the struggle, it would feel like nothing we were doing had any purpose at all. And this is backed by the science too. Just one of many articles I found on the National Library of Medicine, for example, at a quick glance, showed a strong correlation between those with high work engagement, what they defined as people working hard because they enjoy it, and a high ability to regulate positive emotions and good health. Cultivating a love for hard work isn't just something you can brag to your friends about. It quite literally will make you a healthier person mentally and physically over time. So even for people that just want to sit back and enjoy a game with no problems, I would bet if they really thought about it, a game with no problems or a life with no struggle wouldn't be much of a game or life at all. But now I want to touch on a topic that might be a little controversial. And that's that the rise of accessibility in games may just be a glaring issue that flies in the face of the same struggle that makes games so magical. You see, I'm not talking about things like colorblind modes, custom controllers, or increased font sizes. Those are all great and allow more people to play the games we love despite their conditions. What I'm speaking to more is things like easy or god modes, heavy reliance on saving, or even specific features like arachnophobia filters. Because even for something that seems as unobtrusive as a spider being a block of text or blob instead of the real thing, can have drastic effects on the art and meaning behind games. For example, Lethal Company and Grounded are among a slew of recent releases that allow players to completely remove spider depictions in their game if they so choose, for those that have a striking fear of the creepy crawlers. And while this seems like nothing more than a harmless option to give people the choice to do what they want, I actually think it's a lot more detrimental than just that. Because when you're playing a game like Lethal Company or Grounded, the spiders are meant to be a huge and scary threat. They were put into the game under the specific conditions and presumption in design that players would see them and feel a sense of terror as they ran away or figured out a solution. But when you remove the intense look of these monsters entirely, it takes away so much of what the games aim to be. Because even for people with a horrible fear of spiders, myself included, it's the struggle and suffering of going up against their fear and conquering it that makes the experience so much more memorable and impactful. By even giving players the option to simply bypass struggle like this, you also rob them of the enlightening moments they otherwise could have had if they faced those fears head on. It's the same problem so much of our society has in modern days as well, where we try to coddle and protect so much of our own and others' innocence that we forget how vital pain and growth is too. And also, how linked both are. And I know how ridiculous it might sound that I'm complaining about people having an option to turn off spiders in games, but truthfully, it's the deeper principle behind it all that worries me the most. Imagine if a game like Dark Souls had an easy option, where your health pool was tripled and even the most difficult bosses died to just a couple hits. It would entirely defeat the point of the series in the first place. And when I see other gamers or YouTube commenters beg for ways to make FromSoft or other types of games easier, I feel like they're completely missing the point. Games, just like life, aren't all about you. Just because you want to be able to play something, or just because something is too hard for a certain group of people, doesn't mean we should make it easier. Because guess what? In the real world, things will never be easy, and it's only by facing challenges and difficulty head on that we become something we're actually proud of. And the reason I think games for the most part should strive for this as well is because whether it's in our real lives or in a fictitious game world, the core psychology of hard work and overcoming struggle still are intrinsic to our fulfillment as people. You may not like it, but our souls as human beings crave something more than just endless fun, than a life with no other purpose than being happy, whatever that even means. And it's for that same reason that I've kept arguing in multiple videos that more games should do away with save systems that allow us to save scum or have do-overs for vital moments. I get why people like it. I mean, hell, I have played so many RPGs where I do it constantly before every big choice, because it allows me to see all of the outcomes as well as craft my perfect story. But when you go back and play a game like Baldur's Gate 3 in Honor Mode, which doesn't even have any manual saves at all, it makes you realize how much more of an impact choices have when there are real consequences. Once again, the struggle and hardship is the key ingredient in our experience. Having a get out of jail free card or a filter for every scary monster sounds nice on paper, but in reality, it's only good in the moment. And just like an addictive drug, only feels happiness in the short term while sapping away all the fulfillment we would have otherwise had long term. Another great example is Alan Wake 2, the first horror game I ever got into because of how scared of them I usually am. I had to force myself every day to play despite my apprehensions and fears. But by the time I beat it, I felt so satisfied that I had done it, and along the way garnered a completely new appreciation for the genre, and I've been playing a lot of the other horror greats ever since. With too many accessibility features, I could have turned off all the jump scares, removed any disturbing images like spiders and undead, and filled the background with fun children's birthday party music instead of haunting chimes. But only by foregoing any sort of accessibility to help me with my fears did I experience something greater and everlasting by conquering it myself. And because we as humans have a propensity to take the easy route, despite it maybe not being what's actually best for us, I think it's important as many games as possible force this difficulty on us, because that's where we see real growth and have memories of our favorite games of all time. I will say though, I do see the other side. For example, imagine you have a grandma or father who has never played games their whole life trying to engage with even the most basic of FPS games. They would struggle to shoot, to walk, and wouldn't even have the faintest sense of how different fundamental mechanics we've all grown up with work. So for people like this, having features to make things more easy to handle or accomplish would be really great. But once again, even in cases like this, I would argue that only a very few handful of games should even remotely focus on an audience like this. Because at the end of the day, some level of struggle is required when first getting into anything, and creating too much accessibility, too much ease of access, or dumbing down of mechanics just makes the experience worse for everyone who already went through the satisfying challenge to first get into games, or anything for that matter. And to finally drive home my point, I want to give a very specific example from a game I've been enjoying quite a lot recently, and that game is Enshrouded. As of the time of writing this, the game has only been out for around a month and is still deep into the throes of early access, with surprisingly only some of the issues that tag usually brings. It takes place in the mystical world of Embervale, where you must venture forth and survive at any cost necessary, building homes, meeting NPCs, and adventuring and fighting enemies all along the way. But no matter how much I love this game, I can't help but shake the feeling that it's missing one very crucial ingredient, something that would otherwise elevate it to a must-buy status, and also something I hope I can look back on years from now to see the game's evolved into, and that is the easy difficulty. You see, over a year ago now, I actually first started falling in love with the survival genre in the first place. The only game I had played up to that point which spoke to me in any way was Subnautica, and that experience was so good that I've been fighting to find something similar ever since. Which led me down the path to play tons of survival games, all of which I found so lacking and devoid of character or actually engaging mechanics. That was until I found Valheim. But despite how amazing Valheim and its world, crafting, and sense of adventure are, Enshrouded does so many things better. The graphics are more realistic, the art style is in my opinion more beautiful, base building is more streamlined and in-depth with the ability to even build entire underground and flying cities, along with combat, movement, and questing being miles ahead of anything Valheim has even attempted. However, there's a special sense of accomplishment and pride in Valheim that I just haven't felt in Enshrouded yet. Because the one thing that Valheim has that Enshrouded right now doesn't is an actual sense of challenging, of suffering. In Enshrouded, after spending an hour gathering materials for building or upgrading, all you have to do is simply open your minimap and teleport to your base in an instant, regardless of where you are. Whereas in Valheim, certain materials needed for crafting higher level gear can only be found in tougher biomes, and you can't teleport with those materials back. And considering all of your smelters and crafting apparatus are likely built far away in the starting zone, in order to actually bring things back to your stations to progress, you will be looking at a massive journey across land and sea, hauling thousands of pounds of stones and branches in order to make it back home. And when I say massive, I mean it. There are points in the game where you will spend literal in real life days trying to get back safely with a group of friends after work or school. And if at any point in the journey you die, you lose everything and must go all the way back and fight your way through hordes of enemies, or sometimes accept the fact everything is just gone forever. When we look at Enshrouded in comparison, it couldn't be any further from this. Even death here only involves dropping some of your materials, all of which you can simply teleport to a nearby tower and fly back to quickly pick up. And what this boils down to is the sense that Enshrouded is so much more streamlined. Death isn't as punishing, resource gathering is much less of a chore, and fighting a boss is as simple as walking up and throwing a spell at it instead of spending hours making a summoning ritual like in Valheim. And even things like building in Enshrouded are so much easier, which allows for more fantastical and unrealistic structures. While in Valheim you must meticulously place each piece, as any building could topple over at a moment's notice if there isn't enough structural integrity that you planned from the beginning. And because of all of this, Enshrouded in a lot of ways is a much easier game to get get into. And when you combine that with the fact that it has core systems that in most cases are much better feeling and easier to understand, I would argue a lot of players at first glance would actually prefer it. But you see, the real magic behind Valheim, and my biggest gripe with Enshrouded, is that difficulty and struggle is actually so key to what makes games memorable in the first place, especially survival ones. Even though my first impressions and moment-to-moment gameplay in Enshrouded felt superior, I never had any strong and visceral emotions and moments like I did in Valheim. Because in Valheim, everything you do feels like an accomplishment. Every house you build, every piece of material you gather, or new zone you stumble upon genuinely gives you a sense of elation, not only because of how fun of a game it is to play, but because getting there wasn't easy. At no point during your playthrough does Valheim hold your hand or try to make things easy for you. At every step, no matter how much work you have to put to get there will be trials and tribulations that will test your mental and physical fortitude. I distinctly remember my first time playing Valheim when I originally encountered the swamp zone with my two other buddies. None of us had been here before, and because previously we were destroying goblins in the forest without a second thought, we started to feel overconfident. But the second we stepped foot into the swamps, we were surrounded by mud that slowed us down, zombies that could kill us in one hit, and an ominous mist that made it hard for us to see further ahead. And lo and behold, we died a lot. So much so that we lost all of our items and materials that we had spent over 10 hours farming for in-game non-stop, now all trapped behind enemy territory with no easy way for us to get them back safely. And in that moment, quite honestly, this really sucked. We had spent so much time working on all of our different upgrades for our characters and base, and in a moment's notice, this ruthless world stripped it all away from us. I was really pissed and came super close to just quitting on the spot right there. But you see, moments of intense struggle like this often are the catalyst for something greater. And in this instance, we banded together to gather wood to make one final boat to sail to the swamp in as a last gambit to get our stuff, our literal 6th attempt over hours of play. And it was in this last effort that we were finally able to navigate the roaring riverbeds and narrowly dodge enemy arrows to grab our things, and barely make it out alive with our boat sinking in the final moments as we swam to shore and away from danger. Times like these are what make games so great. Moments that you'll never forget with friends, or stories that you tell yourself and remember, in my case over a year later, because of the hardships you had to endure to see victory. And for as much as I'm loving Enshrouded so far, the key element that's missing is that sense of suffering that takes games from great to unforgettable. Because in Enshrouded, even little things like mineral veins replenishing every day, whereas in Valheim they disappear forever, seem like small differences. But they all add up to starkly show the problem in something that is simply fun to play versus something that creates stories that last with us forever. And by streamlining so much of what makes survival games difficult in an attempt to focus more on the adventure and gameplay, along the way, Enshrouded lost something crucial too. Not because it tried to do something different, that being a survival game less about the survival and more about the actual fun portions, but because those fun portions aren't contrasted enough by the struggles that necessitate them. Because at the end of the day, maybe almost paradoxically, it's the pain and suffering that makes this life so worth it. Where behind every battle and fight against something hard, there's a view into something beautiful in the end. And remember, just like in the games we play, you're the main character in your life too. Where every second of struggle, rejection, or failure gives birth to a chance at enhancing yourself into the hero you were meant to be from the start. And no matter how hard life can get, or how grueling trying to beat that next boss in a game can be, those moments of pain and of suffering are the moments that define the hero in every journey. And only by facing the worst life has to offer with open arms will we also be embraced by it in times of pure bliss. Games in life aren't just about having fun or being happy every day. They are about making the sacrifices to become something greater, to reach our max level, whatever that may be, and defeat the final bosses. About doing the hard things not because you have to, but because your soul needs to. The beauty of suffering in games and in life is that only through the suffering do we find the greatest things out there. And that's what purpose, what meaning, is really all about. So no matter how hard that level is, or how much you're struggling in your day-to-day life, never forget that it's that same struggle that will be the impetus for future nostalgia and experiences that you look back on fondly. And as always, thank you guys for watching. It's so cool I get to make videos like this here for you guys in my free time, and despite all of the ups and downs, I can't thank you all enough for the kind words and criticisms alike that help me improve day in and day out. We're inching closer and closer to 100,000 subs every day, a number I never could have imagined before. So let me know down below what you guys think about suffering in games and how it's affected your real lives as well. I love seeing all the stories. And check out the links in the description to my other social media or membership programs if you want to support what I do here even more and help me reach more and more people. Until next time.